My name is Victoria Ashford. I am 41 years old. And on a Tuesday morning in the middle of March, I sat in a conference room on the 14th floor of a downtown Houston law firm, across a glass table from my brother, and watched him try to steal $5 million using my name. He didn't recognize me at first. That is the part I come back to, even now, sitting in the quiet of my apartment some evenings, when the city is settling into itself and I am doing the same. 17 years. That is how long it had been since we'd spoken in anything more than obligatory pleasantries at family dinners. He walked in with his attorney, a civil litigator from Dallas I had never met in person, and he sat down across from me in his pressed gray suit with the confidence of a man who had never once considered that his plan might have a flaw. And for a long breath he just looked at me the way you look at a stranger you are trying to place. The way you look at someone you are almost certain you know from somewhere but cannot quite locate. Then the color left his face, every bit of it, gone in the span of about 2 seconds, like someone had reached in and turned off a light behind his eyes. I set my legal pad on the table. I uncapped my pen. I adjusted my chair slightly. And then I said, in the same voice I use in every courtroom and every conference room in this city, "Good morning. I'm Victoria Ashford, appointed probate attorney for the estate of Eleanor Constance Ashford, deceased." My voice did not shake. My hands did not shake. I had been waiting for this moment for 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days, and I had practiced the stillness the way a surgeon practices steadiness. Not by suppressing what I felt, by converting it into something else entirely. Into patience, into precision, into this. His attorney leaned over and said something very quietly into his ear. My brother, whose name is Dennis Raymond Ashford, 45 years old, software sales consultant formerly of Dallas, Texas, did not respond to him. He kept looking at me. His jaw had gone tight. His hands on the table were not quite flat. What he did not know was that I had specifically requested this assignment, that I had arranged, through the proper channels, to be placed on this case as probate attorney of record, that I had known for months exactly when he was coming and exactly what he had filed, and that everything he had forged, every document he had signed and submitted and notarized in my name, every petition and filing and supporting exhibit, was already documented in a 6-inch binder sitting in the office of the Harris County District Attorney, White Collar Crimes Division, signed off by the supervising investigator, and ready for the criminal trial that was already scheduled. This is that story. I grew up in a house in Cypress, Texas, a suburb about 25 miles northwest of downtown Houston. The house was a pale yellow colonial on a cul-de-sac called Renfield Court, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, a detached garage my father used for weekend projects, and a backyard with a live oak tree that my grandmother said had been there since before her own mother was born. The house smelled like warm bread on Sunday mornings, and like her particular brand of hand lotion in the evenings. That smell is one of the most reliable things I carry from my childhood. My grandmother's name was Eleanor Constance Ashford, though everyone called her Gran. She moved in with us when I was 8 years old, after my grandfather, a man named Harold Ashford, who had worked 43 years for the City of Houston's Public Works Department, passed from a stroke in the early spring of that year. She came with 2 things: her upright Yamaha piano, which had been in her bedroom for as long as anyone could remember, and her discipline, which was something she had constructed so carefully over so many decades that it had become indistinguishable from her personality. She was not a cold woman. She was a warm woman with a cold infrastructure. There is a difference. Gran had been a school teacher for 31 years in the Cypress Fairbanks Independent School District, 6th grade English and, for the last 9 of those years, 7th grade literature. She retired with a full pension and with a savings account she had built through decades of extreme care with money. She had also, upon my grandfather's death, sold the house they had shared for $240,000. Which she converted into a diversified portfolio of conservative investments managed by a financial advisor at a firm in Memorial she had chosen herself after interviewing 3 candidates. She drove a 10-year-old Buick LeSabre that she kept in immaculate condition. She wore the same 4 cardigans in rotation. She made biscuits from scratch every single Sunday morning and said, with the same certainty she applied to everything, that waste was the one sin she had never been able to bring herself to forgive. She meant it about money. She also meant it about people. My mother, Sandra Ashford, was a dental hygienist at a practice in Katy. She worked Tuesday through Friday and was home most evenings, which meant she was the parent who was physically present. Though present did not always mean attentive in the way I needed. She was a kind woman in a distracted way, the kind that is genuine but slightly blurred at the edges. My father, Robert Ashford, sold industrial filtration equipment for a company based in Beaumont and was on the road most weeks, home on weekends, and present at dinner with the particular exhausted cheerfulness of a man who had been performing energy for strangers all week and had very little left by Friday evening. They were a solid couple. They were good parents in the ways they understood being good parents to mean. They were also, and I want to say this with as much clarity and as little resentment as I can manage, very unequal in the way they loved their children. Dennis was 4 years older than me. He was the kind of older brother who moved through rooms like weather, absorbing all the attention without apparent effort. He was funny in a loud way, handsome in the careless way of someone who has never had to work at being noticed, and smart in the particular mode that allows you to get by without ever working very hard at anything. He could charm any adult he met within approximately 4 minutes. He had a gift for making people feel like the most important person in the room, and he deployed that gift with the ease of someone who has never once examined its mechanism or questioned its ethics. My parents adored him with the particular quality of forgiveness that some parents reserve for their firstborn, a ceiling that I could never quite locate no matter what Dennis did. When Dennis failed 2 semesters at Sam Houston State University and came home at 20 to figure out his next move, my father called it finding himself. When I completed my undergraduate degree at the University of Texas at Austin with a 3.9 GPA and a letter of commendation from the Department of Government, my mother said, "Just make sure you find time to meet people, sweetheart. You work too hard." I want to be precise here because I think precision is the only antidote to the kind of story that can slide into self-pity if you are not careful. I am not telling you I was a tragic child. I had friends. I had a small group of girls I had known since middle school who were genuinely good to me. I had Mrs. Bouchard, my 11th grade English teacher at Cypress Falls High School, who told me one afternoon after class that I had what she called a legal mind and that I should do something specific with it. I had my grandmother. Gran noticed everything about me with the same quiet consistency with which she noticed everything in her world, the same attention she gave to when the live oak needed trimming, to when the milk was 2 days from turning, to when a student was struggling before they had said a single word about it. She noticed me, steadily and without ceremony, for my entire life. That is not a small thing to have been given. But Dennis had a talent I want to describe carefully because I think it is important. He had a talent for rewriting the family narrative to his own advantage, and he did it so naturally and so consistently that it became the operating system of how we all understood what had happened and why. 3 examples. I want to give you 3, because I think 1 is a pattern you can dismiss, and 3 is a pattern you have to reckon with. When I was 16 years old, I spent the summer working at a plant nursery in Cyprus called Greenbrook Gardens, loading bags of mulch and watering flats of annuals from 7 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, 5 days a week, for 10 weeks. I saved $1,120 in an envelope in the top drawer of my desk. In August, I came home and opened the drawer, and the envelope had $312 in it. Dennis, who was living at home again between ventures, told me he had borrowed it and would pay it back, and that he had needed it for a situation that was now resolved. My father told me to be more understanding of my brother's circumstances. I never saw $708 of that money again. I did not raise it a second time. I made a note of it somewhere very interior and very permanent. When I graduated from the University of Houston Law School in May, 13 years ago, we had a small dinner at a restaurant in Midtown Houston. 14 people, a private room, a set menu my mother had arranged. Dennis arrived 1 hour and 12 minutes late, ordered a double bourbon before anyone had touched their bread, and spent the majority of the dinner telling an elaborate story as about a business opportunity in commercial real estate that he was in the early stages of developing. At the end of the evening, my father picked up the check and said, while signing the receipt, "Dennis, you should be proud of your sister." Dennis said, without looking up from his phone, "Oh, she's fine. She's always been fine." My mother laughed. It was the kind of laugh that functions as a buffer. I drank my water and I watched my grandmother's face across the table. Gran was not laughing. She was watching Dennis with an expression I had learned, over a lifetime, to read as a specific kind of knowledge. The kind you arrive at about a person and then cannot unarrive at. The 3rd example is the one that matters most, and it begins approximately 3 years before everything else I am about to tell you. In January, when I was 38 and Gran was 81, she was diagnosed with early-stage congestive heart failure by her cardiologist at Houston Methodist. She called a family meeting. She did not call it a family meeting. She simply told my mother that she needed both Dennis and me to come home on the second Sunday of February. I drove up from my apartment in Midtown. Dennis flew in from Dallas, where he had been living for 6 years, cycling through business ventures that never quite landed, most of them in commercial real estate and one of them in a franchise arrangement I had never fully understood, but that had ended, as I gathered, badly. Gran sat in the armchair in her room on the second Sunday of February, a room that still smelled like her hand lotion and had the Yamaha piano in the corner, and the same 4 cardigans folded over the back of the same straight-back chair. She had her hands folded in her lap. She told us about the diagnosis, calmly and without theater. She said she was not in immediate danger and that her cardiologist was managing her condition carefully and that she expected several more years in reasonable health. Then she said she wanted to discuss her estate. She told us she had been working with an estate attorney named Harold Fitch for the past 3.5 years. She had constructed a revocable living trust during that time, methodically and deliberately. She told us the trust would distribute her assets upon her death. Her remaining investment portfolio, the proceeds from her life insurance policy, and the house on Renfield Court in Cyprus, which she had retained after my parents eventually moved to a smaller place in Katy, and which she had been renting to a young couple for $1,400 a month for the past 4 years. The total value of the trust, she said, was approximately $5,200,000. She said approximately because the portfolio fluctuated. Dennis sat perfectly still. I had never seen him sit so still. It was like watching a machine pause mid-operation. Gran said something then that I have returned to so many times since that it has worn itself smooth in my memory from handling. She looked at both of us and she said, "I have been very specific in my trust about who receives what, and I have been equally specific about why. I would ask that neither of you contest it, because I have thought about this for considerably longer than either of you has been alive." Dennis smiled his wide, effortless smile and said, "Of course, Gran." I nodded once. Gran looked at me for a beat longer than the moment required, and then she looked away. I drove back to Houston that evening. I sat in my apartment in Midtown with a glass of water, and I thought about that extra beat. Gran had always communicated in the spaces between words as fluently as she communicated in the words themselves. 2 weeks later, my phone rang at 9:47 in the evening. The caller identified himself as Harold Fitch, Eleanor Ashford's estate attorney. He said my grandmother had asked him to call me. She had amended the trust that afternoon. She had named me as executor. She had not told Dennis. I sat at my kitchen table after that call for a long time, not in shock exactly, in recognition. I know now that what happened next was already forming in Dennis's mind before Gran's body had been transferred from Renfield Court to the funeral home. I know this because of the timing of certain internet searches on his phone, which the DA's investigator would later pull via warrant, and because I know my brother well enough, after 41 years of watching him operate, to understand that he does not grieve the way most people grieve. He calculates. Gran passed on a Saturday morning in late September, quietly, in her sleep, at the house on Renfield Court. My parents were there. I arrived within 90 minutes. The house was very quiet. The live oak in the backyard was beginning to turn. Dennis arrived 3 hours after she passed. He walked in, embraced my mother, shook my father's hand, and then stood at the foot of Gran's bed and looked at her with an expression that I had no word for in the moment. Now I do. It was inventory. The funeral was the following Wednesday. 43 people attended, neighbors and former students, and a few longtime friends from the Cypress Fairbanks community. Gran had no shortage of people who had known her long and well. The minister said she was a woman of unusual precision and unusual warmth, and that in his experience those two qualities rarely occupied the same person, but that Gran had carried them both without apparent effort. I thought that was exactly right. The reception was at my parents' house in Katy afterward. It was a warm afternoon for late September. My mother had put out a spread in the dining room. People came and went in that gentle, floating way of funeral receptions, speaking quietly, holding plates of food they mostly didn't eat. I was standing near the hallway when Dennis found me and said, quietly, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" He led me into my father's study off the front hall and closed the door. He said, "We need to talk about the trust," I said. "Harold Fitch will be in touch to schedule the formal reading." probably within the week. He said, "I don't want to wait for a reading. I've got a situation right now that needs capital, and I need to know what we're looking at." I said, "That isn't how a trust works, Dennis. You know that." He said, "Don't lawyer me, Victoria. We're not in a courtroom." He said it in the tone of someone who has used casual condescension so long it has become reflex. "I just want to know what she left and what my share is." I said, "Harold Fitch will be in touch." I opened the study door and walked back out into the reception. 3 days after that conversation, Harold Fitch received, by certified mail, a formal petition to contest Grand's trust, filed on the grounds of alleged undue influence in its construction. The petition bore my name, my signature, my Texas bar registration number, and the letterhead of a small law firm in North Dallas. Someone had forged all four. I found out because Harold Fitch called me the following morning, puzzled, asking whether I had intended to file a contest petition simultaneously while also serving as executor of the estate, since those roles would be in direct conflict. I told him I had not filed anything. I asked him to read me the registration number on the document. He read it. It was mine, with 2 digits transposed in the secondary registration identifier, close enough to suggest careful research and sloppy enough to be provably wrong. I sat at my kitchen table for 16 minutes. I know it was 16 because I was watching the clock above the stove, the way you watch something when you are trying to hold yourself very still. Then I picked up my phone and I made 3 calls. The first call was to the State Bar of Texas's Unauthorized Practice and Ethics Complaint Line. I reported the unauthorized use of my bar number and signature on a fraudulent legal filing and requested an immediate case number. The second call was to the Harris County District Attorney's Office, White Collar Crimes Division. I spoke to an intake officer and told her I needed to report a probate fraud and forgery of a legal instrument, and that I had reason to believe I knew who had done it. The third call was back to Harold Fitch. I asked him to preserve every copy of everything that had been submitted under my name and share it with no one else until I gave explicit authorization. He agreed. He was a thorough and careful attorney, and he understood, without my spelling it out, that something serious was underway. I did not call Dennis. I did not call my parents. I did not call anyone who would tell me to calm down, to consider his circumstances, to think about what this would do to the family. I had thought about the family my entire life. I had been thinking about the family since the summer I was 16, and my envelope came up $708 short. I was done thinking about the family. I built it in silence. That is the phrase that keeps coming back to me when I think about the 2 years and 4 months that followed. I built it in silence because silence was the only thing that would work, because the moment I told anyone who might tell him, the evidence trail changed. The moment he knew I knew, the calculation changed, and I needed the calculation to stay exactly where it was, with him confident and comfortable and utterly oblivious, right up until the moment he walked through that conference room door. The Harris County DA's office assigned a senior investigator named Catherine Broussard to the case. She was 53 years old, gray-haired, and spoke in the measured, unhurried cadence of someone who had been professionally lied to for 30 years and had calibrated her skepticism accordingly. She was exceptional at her job. We met 12 times over the course of the investigation, always in the same conference room at the DA's office on Fannin Street, always with the same coffee she brought in a stainless thermos from home, because she did not trust the office machine. On our third meeting, she told me this was one of the cleaner probate fraud cases she had encountered, in terms of documentation, and that my brother had made several significant errors. The first error was the notary. He had used a Dallas notary named Bruce Kellerman, whose commission had been suspended 6 months before the date on the document. A document notarized by a suspended notary is not legally notarized. It is simply paper with a seal on it that was placed there without authority. The moment Catherine pulled Kellerman's commission history, the petition was not just fraudulent. It was not even a valid document. The second error was the bar registration number. He had researched my number with sufficient care to get all but 2 digits correct. But those 2 digits, transposed in the secondary portion of the identifier, were enough to confirm that the person who filled out the form was not me. If I had filled out the form, my own number would have been correct. The error was not sloppiness. It was a limitation of impersonation. You can fake someone's name. You cannot fake their own certainty about their own information. The third error was the letterhead. He had used the letterhead of a small litigation firm in North Dallas called Barker & Wynn, where he had done some paralegal administrative work approximately 15 years ago. He had, apparently, retained or reconstructed their letterhead from that time. The problem was that Barker and Wynne had a managing partner named Gerald Wynne, who was still practicing and who was not pleased when Catherine Broussard's office contacted him to learn that his firm's name and stationery had been used in a fraudulent probate filing. He provided a sworn statement within a week. The fourth error, and possibly the most significant, was the email. Through a lawfully obtained warrant served in the spring of the following year, Catherine secured Dennis's email account records from his provider. The draft of the fraudulent petition was in his sent folder, composed on his laptop, with a timestamp of 6:43 in the morning, the day before the certified mail was postmarked. He had drafted it, sent it to a printing service, paid for the print job with a credit card in his own name, and mailed it from a FedEx location in Dallas at 11:17 that morning. The metadata trail was not ambiguous. His phone's browser history from the 2 weeks prior included 17 searches, among them my bar registration number, the address of Harold Fitch's firm, whether probate contest filings were public record, and how long Texas probate proceedings typically took to resolve. He had not been impulsive. He had planned it. While Catherine's office was building the criminal case, I was building my own. I filed a motion with the Harris County Probate Court in November of the first year, requesting formal appointment as probate attorney of record for the estate of Eleanor Ashford. My motion cited the conflict of interest created by the fraudulent filing submitted under my name, the need for independent counsel to administer the estate, and my direct knowledge of the estate's structure as executor. The motion was heard and granted. I was now, formally and on the public court record, the attorney of record on the case. Dennis's attorney of record, a Dallas civil litigator named Gary Pelham, who I knew by reputation as competent and ethical, received the court notices in the normal course. My name appeared on them. But Gary Pelham had no reason to connect the name Victoria Ashford, probate attorney, with any sister of his client. Dennis had presumably not told him. I want to pause here, because if you have been watching this long, I think you have earned something more than just the mechanics of a legal case. I have thought many times about whether I should have reached out to Dennis before any of this was set in motion, whether I should have given him the chance to withdraw the filing, to correct what he had done, to face me directly before the consequences became what they became. I come back to the same moment every time I ask that question. I come back to my father's study, to the door closed behind us, to Dennis saying, "Don't lawyer me, Victoria," as if my professional knowledge was an affectation I was using to annoy him. He was not confused about what he had done. He was not desperate in a way that deserved compassion. He was precise. He was deliberate. He had already forged the documents before he walked into that with me. The conversation was not him asking for help. It was him testing what I knew. Those are very different things. If you have ever had someone in your life look at you exactly like that, not like you were a person, but like you were a variable in their calculation, I want you to drop a comment below and tell me how long it took you before you trusted your own read on it. Because I doubted mine. I doubted it for months. I was trained my whole life to extend the benefit of the doubt to this particular person, and that training does not vanish overnight. But the email metadata does not lie, and neither does the Notary Commission record, and neither does the fact that he used my name. The months of the investigation had a texture I am still not sure how to describe. On the surface, everything looked entirely normal. I worked, I handled cases, I had dinner with friends, I called my mother on Sundays. When she mentioned, during 3 separate Sunday calls, that Dennis had phoned her to ask whether I had said anything to anyone about the estate, I thanked her for telling me and wrote down the dates. When I appeared at probate court hearings on the estate as attorney of record and Gary Pelham appeared on behalf of Dennis, we exchanged the ordinary professional courtesies of 2 attorneys on opposite sides of a civil matter. He was cordial, he was capable. In our 9 telephonic conferences, he gave me no reason to think he understood what was actually happening. I gave him none either. In the spring of the second year, in addition to the email evidence, Catherine Broussard's office secured a statement from Bruce Kellerman, the decommissioned notary, who confirmed, when presented with the documentary evidence, that he had placed his seal on the filing without being aware his commission had lapsed, and that he had been approached by a man who had paid him $300 in cash and provided a completed document, a document he had not read carefully. Kellerman was granted limited immunity in exchange for his cooperation. He was also a secondary target of the State Bar of Texas. but that was a separate matter. In February of the following year, the DA's office filed formal criminal charges. Forgery of a legal instrument, which in Texas is a felony in the 3rd degree. Probate fraud. An unauthorized practice of law, because he had signed and submitted legal documents as if he were a licensed Texas attorney, which he was not. That last charge was the one with the most significant sentencing exposure and the one most useful in encouraging a plea negotiation. I requested, through the proper professional channels, that I be permitted to remain as probate attorney of record through the resolution of the civil estate matter, which would run concurrent with the criminal case. The request was granted by the probate court. I was also specifically authorized to participate in the initial scheduling conference for the civil proceeding, which had been calendared for that Tuesday in March. Dennis did not know I was coming. He did not know when Gary Pelham's assistant confirmed the conference who would be sitting across the table. And then he walked in, and he sat down and he looked at me. The room on the 14th floor was not a large room. Besides me and my paralegal Reena Chandra, who has worked with me for 6 years and who knew every piece of this case from the beginning, there was a court reporter, a representative from the probate court, and Gary Pelham, who stood when Dennis came in, and then turned and for the first time saw me. And I watched the calculation happen behind his eyes, quick and professional, and I saw the moment he understood something was wrong. I said, "Good morning. I'm Victoria Ashford, appointed probate attorney for the estate of Eleanor Constance Ashford, deceased. For the record, I am also the individual whose name, signature, and bar registration number appear on the contested petition submitted to this court on the 12th of October. I want to state clearly that I did not file that petition, did not authorize it, and have been cooperating with the Harris County District Attorney's Office regarding that submission for the past 26 months. Dennis said, "Victoria." I said, "Mr. Ashford, I'd recommend speaking only through your attorney from this point forward." Gary Pelham was already close to Dennis, speaking quietly. Dennis sat back. He had aged in the years since I had last really looked at him. His hair had thinned considerably across the crown. His jaw had gone softer. He looked like a man who had been running a particular set of calculations for years and had just discovered that one of the foundational numbers was wrong. Reena slid a document across the table to Gary Pelham. It was the summary of the criminal charges filed by the DA's office, already public record as of 6 weeks prior. Then she slid a second document, the probate court's formal order from November of 2 years earlier, establishing me as attorney of record. Then a third, a 2-page timeline of the investigation, from my initial call to the DA's office through the filing of charges, with every date and every piece of evidence listed in plain language. I had prepared it not because it was legally required, but because I wanted Dennis to be able to read it and understand, completely and without ambiguity, exactly how long this had been coming. Gary Pelham picked up each document in turn, read it, and set it down. He was a good attorney. His face stayed professional. He did not look at Dennis while he read. The court reporter's keys went steadily. Outside the windows, 14 floors below, Houston moved through its morning with complete indifference to everything happening in that room. I said, "My role today is limited to the civil probate matter. The criminal proceedings are entirely separate and I have no involvement in those as counsel. But I want to be clear that the estate of Eleanor Constance Ashford will be administered exactly as she intended it to be. Her trust documents are valid, properly executed, and uncontestable under Texas law. The petition submitted in my name is withdrawn as of this morning, by motion I filed with the probate court yesterday afternoon. Mr. Pelham, that motion was transmitted to you by email at 7:42 this morning." Gary Pelham checked his phone briefly under the table. He looked at me. He nodded once. Dennis said nothing. He sat with his hands flat on the glass table and he looked at his hands. Not at me, at his hands. I watched him for a moment. I want to be honest about what that moment felt like, because I think people expect a kind of triumph in a story like this, and what I felt was considerably quieter than that. It was the particular feeling of having carried something very heavy for a very long distance, and finally being permitted to set it down. Not victory. Release. There is a difference, and the difference matters. The conference lasted 54 minutes. At its conclusion, Gary Pelham asked for a brief recess to confer with his client. I said of course. Reena and I sat quietly at the table. The court reporter refilled her water. The probate court representative looked at her phone. When Dennis and Gary Pelham came back in and took their seats, Gary Pelham stated, "For the record, that his client was withdrawing all claims against the estate and would cooperate fully with the probate court's administration of the trust. He said it in the careful, composed language of an attorney who is working to limit his client's exposure while the criminal case proceeds separately. I said, "Thank you." I made a note on my legal pad. I asked Rena to confirm she had everything. She said she did. Dennis looked at me one time before he stood to leave. His eyes were red at the edges. Not crying, not quite, but the kind of close that sits at the border of a thing for a long time. He said my name, just my name, Victoria. I said, "Take care of yourself, Dennis." And then he was gone. The criminal case moved through the courts in the months that followed. In September of that year, Dennis entered a guilty plea to forgery of a legal instrument and 1 count of probate fraud. The unauthorized practice of law charge was reduced as part of the plea arrangement. He was sentenced to 4 years of probation, 400 hours of community service, and restitution to the estate in the amount of $62,417 to cover legal costs incurred during the investigation and civil proceedings. I administered Grand's estate through the remainder of that year. I will not detail the specific distributions because they are not mine to share. What I will say is that Grand's intentions were precise and considered and reflected exactly the woman I had known my entire life. She had thought about it, as she told us she had, longer than either of us had been alive. She had been right about everything. My parents did not speak to me for 4 months after the guilty plea. This was not, I think, a conscious decision on their part so much as an absence they did not know how to cross. My mother sent me a text message in the following February, on a Thursday afternoon, that said simply, "I hope we can get past this." I thought about that message for a long time. Past this. As though something impersonal had happened. As though there had been a storm that had swept through all of us equally, and the question now was just about recovery. I called her back that same evening. We talked for a little over an hour. I did not apologize. I explained, as precisely and as gently as I was capable of, what Dennis had done, what it would have meant for me professionally and legally had I not reported it, and what Gran had clearly and deliberately intended for her estate. My mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "She always did love you differently." I said she loved us both. But I understood what she meant. Gran had seen me. She had seen me clearly and consistently and without distortion for my entire life, and she had trusted me with the most important thing she had to give at the end of hers. That is not a small thing. I have tried not to treat it as a small thing. Dennis and I have not spoken since the conference room. I do not anticipate that changing, at least not any near future I can see. There is a version of this story, I know, that ends with a phone call, with an apology that means something, with the slow and imperfect work of repair. Maybe that version becomes possible someday. I cannot say. What I can say is that I am not waiting for it, and that the waiting or not waiting for it is entirely my choice. That, too, is not a small thing. What I want to say to you now, if you are somewhere in this world watching this, because some piece of this story is yours, because you have a Dennis in your life, because you have been trained since childhood to make yourself smaller so someone else can fill more room, because you have stayed quiet about something that was done to you in your own name, literally or figuratively, because you have absorbed the losses and the dismissals and the quiet thefts, and called it keeping the peace. The people who dismiss you are counting on your silence, specifically on yours. They have identified, usually early and usually correctly, that you are the one who will not make a scene, the one who will let it go, the one whose discomfort with conflict is greater than their need for what was taken from them. That is the only structural advantage they have. It is not a small advantage, but it is not permanent, and it is not the same as being right. Gran used to say, in her particular way, that the truth does not need defending. It needs only to outlast the lies. She said it about students who plagiarized, about neighbors who spread stories, about a cousin who once accused her of something I will not repeat here. She said it with the quiet confidence of someone who had watched truth outlast lies so many times over so many decades that she had come to treat it not as a hope but as a structural feature of the world. I have held on to that sentence through everything. Every meeting with Catherine Broussard, every telephonic conference with Gary Pelham where I said something neutral while knowing exactly what I knew, every Sunday call with my mother when Dennis's name came up and I said nothing I was not ready to say. The truth did not need me to announce it at the reception, or confront Dennis in the study, or call my parents with accusations. It needed me to document it, protect it, carry it carefully across 2 years and 4 months and 11 days, and place it on a glass table on the 14th floor on a Tuesday morning in March. I closed the estate in May. I completed the last account transfer on a Thursday afternoon and filed the final report with the probate court. And then I took myself to dinner at a quiet restaurant near my office in Midtown that I had been meaning to visit for 2 years. I ordered a glass of a wine I had read about once and not forgotten. I sat by the window and I watched the city move through its early evening, all the people with all their separate weights and separate intentions, and I thought about the yellow house on Renfield Court and the Yamaha piano and the 4 cardigans folded over the back of the straight-back chair. I thought about Gran's biscuits and about Mrs. Bouchard telling me I had a legal mind and that I should do something with it. I thought about the live oak tree that had been there before my grandmother's mother was born. I thought about Gran at the dinner table at my law school graduation, not laughing, watching me across the room with the expression that said, simply and without decoration, "I see you." I still see her clearly. That is the part of this I am most grateful for. Not the resolution, not the documentation, not the 54-minute conference on the 14th floor. The clarity. The fact that I know, without ambiguity or revision, who she was and how she loved me, and that her trust in me was not misplaced, and that I carried it exactly as she intended it to be carried. Here is what I want to leave you with, and I want you to sit with this one, because I think it matters. If someone in your family had used your name against you, your literal name, your actual signature, your professional identity, the credential you built over a decade of work, what would you have done? Would you have confronted them the moment you found out? Or would you have waited, the way I did, and built your response in the silence they assumed was surrender? Tell me in the comments. I read everything. I want to know where you are in this. To everyone in this community, every person who has taken time out of their day to sit with one of these stories, I want you to know that this channel exists because of you. When we started Revenge Chronicles, we did not know if anyone would watch. We did not know if there was a space for stories told this quietly, this carefully, without screaming and without spectacle. You showed us there was. You showed us with your comments and your shares and the messages you send, telling us which episodes you watched twice. Victoria's story is one story among thousands. There are women right now, in kitchens and in cars and in quiet offices, carrying something similar. We will keep telling those stories, every day, one at a time. As long as you keep showing up, we will be here. If this episode meant something to you, subscribe and come back tomorrow. The next story is already waiting, and it was built for exactly the person who needed to hear it most.